What I can guarantee you is that if a person out there watching this program feels threatened in a domestic situation and they pick up a telephone and ring their local police, that there will be an appropriate response. There'll be a proper investigation and they will be protected.
Political promises are so easily made. They might even be sincere when they're made. But police history says the chances are this one will soon be broken. Welcome to Four Corners. You'd have to say domestic violence is one of Australia's most intractable crimes. It was largely a hidden crime, swept under the rug until the women's movement 40 years ago demanded otherwise. That was when women's refuges began to get official government sanction and some financial support. So what progress in 40 years? Well, today, half of all homicides in Australia are connected to domestic violence. In 2008, the most recent year for which there are official figures, there were 134 deaths resulting from domestic violence. In Western Australia, where tonight's story is centred, there have been 11 such deaths so far this year and 156 in the past decade. Andrea Pickett was one of them, with a demonstrably violent husband threatening again and again to kill her. She repeatedly went to police and other agencies for help. They failed her. In fear and despair, she predicted her death, and she was proved right. Andrea Pickett's story is one of two tonight that reflect very poorly on how domestic violence is dealt with or not. The reporter is Quentin McDermott.
It's a cold winter's morning in Perth. And outside the coroner's court, a family is huddled together after hearing the damning findings of an inquest into the death of their close relative.
So all I can say is, how would you feel?
Andrea Pickett predicted she would die at her husband's hands. And when she asked the police and authorities to protect her, they failed to do so.
At ground level, there's still not enough support. Not enough support. People may think
Andrea's family fought for an inquest to take place, hoping for answers to how in this day and age a man can make threats to murder his wife and then carry them out unhindered.
wasn't enough to protect Andrea.
She is still at the centre of their lives, still mourned by those she was closest to.
Beautiful, happy, loving, just caring. She was just, yeah, all about the love.
She was very, very generous person, very kind. Her sense of humour, it was just unique.
She's a funny bugger. She used to have this thing when you were sad and that. She'd do her daddy cool dance. Crack you up every time. Anyone who knows her would know that daddy cool dance. She was a dedicated mum. Loved her little people. She was a really good person. She had a big heart. Do anything for anyone.
Andrea grew up in a large, extended family.
Well, she was the biggest baby I had. I had 8.5. Good baby. Bit of a character, even when she was little.
Like any young girl, she adored her pets and loved fussing over babies.
Wherever there was a baby, you'd find Andrea from yay high. Yeah, just loved babies.
She was very much growing up wanting to have a big family.
As teenagers growing up, we all had photos of pop stars and crap on our wall. She had pictures of babies from the magazines. She even had a scrapbook where she'd have pictures of babies in it. She couldn't wait to be a mum.
Andrea would have been in her first year at high school. She said there and then, I'm having 14 kids when I get married, Mum. I'm going to have 14. I said, there's a lot of kids. I don't care, I'm having 14.
Andrea Pickett very nearly achieved her ambition.
She was an amazing mum, of course.
Yeah, definitely. 13 children, and she loved every single one of them. And she also had grandchildren and her nieces, and the way she looked at all of us as her children as well. It was just a beautiful thing.
The children's father, Kenneth Pickett, was several years older than Andrea. And from the start, her mother didn't approve.
She took off with him. I didn't know where she'd gone. So I had the welfare out looking for her in the police. The next thing I knew, she's wanting permission to get married. And I said, no. If I see him in the street, I'll run him over. I said, no way. Anyway, the day after she turned 18, she married him. But she never told us about the problem she was having with him.
Brush your hair quick.
It was only 20 years later that details of his abuse would start to emerge. At the time, Kenneth Pickett wasn't physically violent towards his wife, but he terrorised her in other ways.
She always had animals and couldn't really explain where they were going. The children kept thinking they were running away. And then she obviously came out and told us that over all those years he was slitting the animals' throats or stabbing them or killing them one way or another, and telling her that it's just making it easier to kill a person.
In January 2008, matters came to a head. Andrea went to her local police station, Armidale, in the outer suburbs of Perth, and made a statement.
I no longer want to be married to Ken, and I've been trying to discuss it with him. Ken doesn't want to be separated. He assaulted me one day last week. He called me a dog, a slut and a whore. He thinks I'm sleeping with other men, but I'm not. He grabbed me around the neck with one hand and squeezed me. I felt the pressure in my head. He dug his nails in and bruised my neck. I couldn't breathe.
That particular night, he tried to strangle her, smash up the house a bit inside, threatened, as he had done a few times before, threatened to kill her. I think over that weekend, he'd also put a steel-bladed fan without the cover on to her face, things like that.
In her formal statement, Andrea Pickett made it clear she was in fear for her life.
I know he can hurt me. I think he will. He often points his fingers at me like as if it were a gun and shoots at me. At times he makes a slit across his throat while he's looking at me. I think something's going to happen to me.
By now, the police had reports of 3 separate incidents, but no charges were laid against Kenneth Pickett for making these threats.
Unfortunately, a number of the first times Andrea made complaints to the police, it didn't appear as though her complaints were taken seriously.
After giving her statement to the police and desperate for a safe place to stay, Andrea Pickett went to crisis care, a division of the Department for Child Protection, asking for emergency accommodation. The child protection workers there told her there was no room in any of Perth's 18 women's refuges for her and her 7 youngest children.
1 in 2 women are still being turned away from crisis accommodation. And so we worry, we're concerned about what happens for those women. I think we've had 2 new refuges funded in the metropolitan area in about 20 years. And so with the population growth, with the increased demand, refuges cannot possibly cope with being able to accommodate. So the reasons why they're turned away is the lack of available beds. And I think governments have been pretty poor in terms of dealing with this issue.
By now, Andrea had decided that enough was enough.
She came basically straight over to my sister's house. She'd already set up an escape plan.
With no beds being offered to her in a refuge, Andrea went to stay with her sister Kelly, who now takes care of Andrea's youngest children. In order to protect the children, we've disguised her identity.
She just said that she couldn't handle it anymore. She couldn't put up with what was going on. I didn't know it was as bad as it was because she kept that to herself. Trying to protect us all, I suppose, as well.
She had been to the police. Crisis care couldn't help her. She had too many kids for them. And no way was she splitting them because she thought he'd use the kids against her. But I know she did say to Kelly, he's going to do it. And when he does, will you look after my babies? I know he's going to do it. And she said, one way or another, he'll do it.
In a further effort to protect herself and her children, Andrea Pickett applied for a violence restraining order, or VRO, against her husband. It didn't stop him menacing her.
He used to have this thing where he'd stand just out of the area for the restraining order, like 100 metres, he'd stand just out of it and she'd ring the police. There was nothing they could do, apparently. Wasn't breaking any laws.
However, in the days immediately after being served with the order, Kenneth Pickett repeatedly broke the law by driving past Andrea's house and phoning the children. Andrea went back to the police, complaining of 5 separate breaches of the VRO. But if Kenneth Pickett wasn't taking it seriously, neither were the police. No proper investigation took place, and no charges were laid.
The main complaint in 2008 that was not investigated of 5 separate breaches was written off at a time when Armadale Station had a campaign in place to reduce the number of outstanding complaints. Writing them off is one way to do it. So it appears as though that complaint was written off as part of a policy rather than because it wasn't possible to obtain a conviction.
On Valentine's Day 2008, Andrea Pickett went to Armadale Police Station again. It was the 4th time in 5 weeks she'd gone to the police seeking their help. She reported that Kenneth Pickett had phoned her daughters with a message. He was going to slit her throat and kill her. Finally, the police acted on the information she was giving them. Just before 11 p.m, they found her husband walking towards her house. A carving knife was hidden in his clothing.
She was able to tell the police that he was next door. Unfortunately, they managed to pick him up. He was then taken into custody, and that was the only time in 2008 that the police actually acted on a complaint by Andrea in any effective manner.
Kenneth Pickett pleaded guilty to the charge of threatening to kill his wife. In her victim impact statement to the court, Andrea Pickett described the trauma she'd suffered.
I'm scared he would kill me. I'm also scared he will kill my children. Knowing he'll be out, I'll have to go and hide with my kids, because I don't feel safe even with a violence restraining order.
By now, Kenneth Pickett was behind bars awaiting sentence. But that didn't mean that Andrea would be safe. He was still making threats in jail.
He made threats to Andrea, and he made threats to Andrea about Andrea's family. And that was a significant matter because Andrea was aware that upon his release, he wasn't just a danger to her, he was a danger to a number of members of her family, all of whom he thought were siding with her and were a barrier to him getting what he wanted upon his release.
When asked by the jail's clinical psychologist whether he was still a threat to his wife, he admitted that he was. Chief Judge Antoinette Kennedy expressed her alarm at what could happen when he got out.
He's saying I'm still a risk. I'm not letting him out. I mean, if he kills her, it will be my fault. It's just that simple.
Despite her concerns, Judge Kennedy sentenced Kenneth Pickett to 14 months jail, but declared him eligible for parole immediately.
I think it was very important to...
Former police officer Murray Cowper is Western Australia's new Corrective Services Minister.
Now, Mr Pickett did present to the parole board and was asked the question whether or not he was a threat to his wife, and he indicated that he perhaps he was, and on that basis his parole was rejected. Mysteriously and unexplainably, a few weeks later he presents again to the parole board and he was released on parole. That was a deadly mistake, in my view.
Andrea was horrified by the decision to release her husband on parole. In her diary, she wrote,
He got 14 months, due for parole now. I just can't believe that he got off so lightly. He'll probably bloody kill me.
In November 2008, Kenneth Pickett was released on parole to live here in the small wheatbelt town of Narrabeen, 300 kilometres from Perth. But nothing was done to ensure he remained in the town. The Department of Corrective Services wrote that, given that he now resides away from Perth, he poses minimal harm to his ex-partner. That was a fatal error. As the coroner at Andrea Pickett's inquest noted sarcastically, it was easy for Mr. Pickett to travel to Perth as a result of the invention of the motor vehicle. And in December 2008, that's exactly what he did.
I think the coroner thought that it was farcical to suggest that having an address in the wheat belt would preclude him from travelling to Perth. I think the suggestion is if you want to murder somebody, you're not going to worry about having to drive 2.5 hours to do it.
Narrabeen is a tiny community, the kind of place where strangers are quickly noticed. Kenneth Pickett was required to live with his sister here and to call in to his parole officer by phone. But he wasn't required to report in person regularly either to her or to the police. And in fact, no one told the police in Narrabeen that Kenneth Pickett was living on parole in their town. This extraordinary failure to monitor Kenneth Pickett would come to light at Andrea's inquest.
Were the conditions that were put in place sufficiently stringent?
Well, we got that answer, Quentin, from the parole officer herself, who said the parole order that was in place was essentially worthless. He was required to report by telephone, but that was him telephoning from a mobile to the parole office. So there was no way of them checking either whether he was in Narrabeen or whether he was complying with any other conditions of parole.
It was a deadly state of affairs. In December 2008, Kenneth Pickett telephoned his parole officer and told her he was going to leave Narrabeen and travel to Perth for Christmas. Remarkably, she agreed to this, reminding him only to abide by his violence restraining order. Andrea Pickett had gone away for Christmas, and when she returned on the 8th of January, she again asked the police for help.
She went to Armadale Police Station, and she did that to ask them if they would accompany her back to her home because she was concerned that Ken Pickett might be there. They declined to travel with her to her home. She went to her home and she found that he had in fact been living there.
We went in the room and that's when I noticed the machete on top of all the papers. Her diaries, which she'd told me before it'd gone missing, were on the ground and there was roughly 32 pieces of paper laying on top of them with a machete on top of that. One of the pieces of paper, front and back, had "I love Andrea Louise Pickett" all over it.
This threatening behaviour by Kenneth Pickett, mixed with his obsessive expressions of love, clearly terrified Andrea. It was also a very clear breach of the VRO and of Kenneth Pickett's conditions of parole. But once again, the police refused to act. When Andrea handed in the machete at Armadale Police Station, officers treated it as a joke.
The police officers were messing around with the machete, doing like their little swordy things with it, and then they asked us if we wanted it back, and it was like, what do we want the machete for, man? Would it be helpful if somebody took it serious, though? I think that's when it dawned on her what his intentions actually were. And we walked out of there and she was like, no, he's going to kill me, they're not going to help me.
They interpreted that as an attitude of treating the whole thing as a joke.
That does come as disturbing to me. However, what I can say is that in the future, police have a whole new regard for the manner in which domestic violence is treated in this state.
The police there didn't take it seriously. They were waving the machete around. Is that good enough?
When Mrs. Pickett brought that documentation, evidence that he is breaching a violent restraining order, he's actually left a weapon behind, the junkyard dogs are barking, and you've got to have a look at it and check it out. There should have been something done about it, and he should have had his nose pulled.
Former Police Superintendent John Watson knows what he's talking about. In 2004, his niece Diane Watson was murdered by her former boyfriend after he repeatedly breached a violence restraining order which she'd taken out against him.
He would do drive-bys, bash on the door, ring her, abuse her, assault her. He was collared, taken back to Armidale Police Station and charged for breach of violent restraint order, and he got a $200 fine. So, $200 fine, he was back out in the streets, and he said he was going to murder her, and he did. What a waste of life. You know, she cared for her son, wanted to bring him up, create her own life, and never had a chance.
Like Diane Watson 5 years earlier, Andrea Pickett wanted to create her own life after separating from her husband. And like Diane Watson, she never stood a chance. 2 nights after discovering the machete in her home, she was walking to the shops with her niece Jade when out of the dark a hooded man approached them. It was Kenneth Pickett. As he drew a knife and confronted the women, Jade called for help on her phone.
Police emergency, how can I help you?
I need a police to get along Rain Highway near Mirrabooka and there's my auntie's just had her husband throw a knife on him. She's got a restraining order on him. We were just walking out to the shops and he walked around along Rain Highway, came towards us, we didn't realise it was him, and he pulled the knife out. So you might be able to catch him along Rain Highway because he did run back that way. But he is in the bushes.
Okay.
He's running to a car.
All right, mate, no worries. I've got the job on. Police will be there as soon as they can for you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
This time, officers from nearby Mirrabooka police station arrived at Diane Simmons's house, where Andrea and Jade had fled. Once again, Andrea's husband had breached his VRO and his conditions of parole. And once again, the police seemed reluctant to take the matter any further.
That cop, he's like, oh, this kind of thing happens here all the time. You know, it's a regular occurrence. Do you know how many knife attacks we have and charges are dropped?
The police officers who attended gave evidence at the inquest. My notes from that inquest show that the lead police officer that night told us that he took a sceptical approach to speaking to the witnesses, and in particular to speaking to Andrea that night. And he also wanted to be testing in his approach, presumably in order to find out whether they were serious about the issue. Now, at that point, Andrea had been threatened by a machete being in her house. She had a man who was on parole for threatening to kill her. She'd just been threatened by a 20-centimetre knife, and her family had called the police for protection and assistance.
Later that night, wielding the knife, Kenneth Pickett tried to force his way into Diane's house. The police now regarded him as armed and dangerous. But despite this, the decision was taken not to organise a search with dogs, a helicopter, or even patrol cars.
Shouldn't an organised search have been carried out for Kenneth Pickett that night using a helicopter or police dogs, or at the very least patrol cars?
In retrospect, I agree that there should have been a proper investigation in relation to that matter.
So to put it bluntly, were the police taking it seriously?
It would be very difficult to say the West Australian Police Service was taking it seriously at that time. And it's quite clear the police were either unwilling or incapable of protecting Andrea, and that is what led to Andrea's murder ultimately.
Look, as an Aboriginal person in Western Australia, one of the most redneck states probably in the world, it's just standard procedure for us. You're not going to get help from the police, you know, when it comes to dealing with our issues.
Mirrabooka police had offered to call crisis care on Andrea Pickett's behalf, but she turned them down, telling them she had asked for help in the past and it wasn't worth the effort. Instead, her cousin Dennis Simmons stepped in. Despite having a full house himself and determined to protect her, he took Andrea and her youngest children into the relative safety of his North Beach home.
In my house there was 6 adults and about 23, 24 children, a 3-bedroom house. And she kept saying to me, you know, they're not going to do anything until he kills me. And I kept thinking to myself and saying to her, well, look, if he comes over here, I'll kill him first.
What I would have looked at is getting her out of the environment, relocating her, similar to witness protection, even send her over east, just get her out of it for about 3 or 4 months, a cooling down period, because that's what normally happens. The predator will track them down through family members, the whole lot, and then he'll warn several times. There'll be drive-bys, phone calls, abusive phone calls. He'll breach it once or twice, but if he says he's going to kill, he normally does.
Oh, hi, Angela.
Angela Hartwig is CEO of Western Australia's peak body for domestic and family violence.
Findings from the coroner's inquest.
Disturbingly, she's now discovered and revealed to Four Corners that crisis care had rooms available in refuges outside Perth in the days leading up to Andrea's murder.
Yes, I need emergency accommodation.
But never offered them to her.
I need to get out of this house right now.
We must say that they should have put them up somewhere safe, even if it was witness protection or out of the metropolitan area in the interim.
Was she scared?
She was terrified.
What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go?
She was really scared and really panicky, and she was really concerned that she couldn't get into a refuge for the children and get the children in there as well.
God, you people are supposed to help me.
So, she was very panicked.
On the evening of the 11th of January, Dennis took Andrea and the kids to the nearby beach for a swim. It was reminiscent of old times spent together.
We were all down there big happy family, and we were all on the beach, and it was probably one of the best nights of my life, and I know it was a really enjoyable night for her and the children.
The next night, Dennis Simmons made a decision he will always regret. With so many restless kids in the house, he took them back to play at the beach to tire them out, leaving the women behind with his uncle who was asleep. When he returned, Kenneth Pickett had been and gone.
I'll always believe that it is my fault, because when she needed me, I wasn't there for her. I wasn't able to protect her when she wanted me or needed me to be there, so that's something that I have to take to the grave with me, I guess.
What Dennis couldn't have known was that Kenneth Pickett had tracked Andrea to his house and broken in.
We thought he was in the house and we ran out the front. We run straight into him, man. He was like, run, Andy, run. We run. I'll never forget those screams.
Here, just before midnight on the 12th of January 2009, Kenneth Pickett finally carried out his threat to kill his estranged wife, Andrea. In an act of extreme brutality, he stabbed Andrea repeatedly, leaving her for dead in front of the house in which she'd been taking shelter. When the police arrived, it took them 4.5 hours to locate Andrea's daughter, who had fled, terrified from her father, and lay cowering under a table in the house.
I just think 4 hours for a traumatised little girl who had drops of her mother's blood on her and was saturated in sweat and scared for her own life. She will realise one day everything will fall into place, and then she's going to constantly have this recurring movie in her head about her mother being murdered by her father, which is a scary thing. You know, all those children have lost their mother, but she witnessed that.
To the family's dismay, the police left Andrea's body lying by the road all that night and for much of the next day before she was finally taken away.
Obviously, for the family to have their sister lying in a hot January day outside in the street for 15 hours compounded the tragedy tenfold.
They operate without a heart, so to speak, and without consideration for the family of the deceased person. And even though it might be important for them to gather information, forensic and stuff like that, they still should take into consideration the family of the deceased person and just plain dignity for people.
They failed Andrea. They failed her on many, many occasions, and not once have we heard sorry, condolences to the family.
As a father, as a husband, and as a former police officer, I'm very sorry in relation to what happened to Mrs. Pickett. and her extended family. But I want to reassure the people of Western Australia that the government hasn't been sitting back idly waiting for a coroner's report to come down and clearly state that there have been some fundamental failures on behalf of a number of government departments in respect to this.
When Andrea Pickett most needed help, officers here at Mirrabooka Police Station failed to provide it, and as a result, Kenneth Pickett was free to hunt her down and kill her. As anger grew over the failings in the system which had enabled him to carry out his crime, changes were announced in the way the police respond to threats of domestic violence. But 2 years after Andrea's murder, when another call for help was made, officers from this station failed once again. And this time too, the outcome would turn out to be tragic. Saori Jones was a young Japanese woman who travelled to Perth on a working holiday and met her husband-to-be Bradley Jones at a bus stop. It was a bad choice of partner. Jones was a drug-taking drunk, a martial arts enthusiast with a prior conviction for attempted armed robbery who was prone to fits of uncontrolled rage. Saori's friends didn't like him.
I would call him like a feral or a bogan. That was sort of the impression I got of him. Tattooed and just didn't look clean, unhygienic and in and out of jobs all the time. But she just felt obliged, I suppose, because they'd had the baby together to... And I suppose being in a strange country, on her own, not having any friends, or very few friends, I suppose she sort of felt indebted to him to marry him, which they did.
But early on in the marriage, Saori Jones confided in an email to a friend the fear she felt living with her new husband. We've translated what she wrote.
About a month ago, when we had a quarrel, he was violent towards me. When we quarrel and he starts drinking beer, I get scared thinking he may be violent again, and my body trembles. He drinks beer almost every day, and I don't want to live in fear every day.
The couple had 2 children together, but as Bradley Jones became increasingly violent, she left him.
What did she tell you he had done to her?
He pushed her in the wall and hit her with the face, and maybe once or twice.
Well, she had a black eye and a bit of a swollen lip.
Yeah. And then she ran away.
Ray and Toyo King did all they could to help.
We took Saori around to the Mirrabooka police station to report it all, explain to them what had happened, and then they came with us. They actually escorted us round to the house because Bradley was still there, and they kept him outside while we and Saori went inside and got some
stuff.
And then she came with us. We brought her back here to our place, made lots of phone calls to different departments trying to get us some emergency accommodation. At the time, couldn't get her into a refuge. They were all full. So she did stay here with us, I forget, 1 or 2 nights.
2 or 3 days.
Eventually, Saori Jones ended up at this women's refuge, where she and her 2 children were cared for by the refuge staff.
She was a lovely lady. She was a beautiful, kind, sweet, gentle woman. Very devoted mother. Just a very, very special person.
Saori was scared when she arrived. Her son was very, very young. She needed a lot of time with him. She was breastfeeding. She used to wheel him around the courtyard to get him to go to sleep.
Despite the violence, Saori Jones wanted her children to know their father. And when she moved out of the refuge and into transitional housing, she ensured that her children maintained contact with him. She could have applied for a violence restraining order against her husband, but was too scared to do so.
I do believe that he had basically said, don't get a violence restraining order. If you do, I'll just make it worse. And this is something that does happen with violence restraining orders. The perpetrators will say, well, you know, you get a violence restraining order and, I'll come after you. It's only a piece of paper.
A violent restraining order is not a shield of steel. If police don't enforce the law when someone breaks it, and it's a court order that you will keep away from that person, then a restraint order is not the worth of the paper it's written on.
There has been a suggestion in the past that violence restraint orders aren't worth the paper they're written on. And I'm here to tell the people of Western Australia that there is a whole new currency when it comes to dealing with violence restraint orders, because if you breach a violence restraint order, you will be arrested. If you breach it again, you will be arrested again, and on the third occasion, you will go to jail.
On Saturday, December the 11th, 2010, Saori's 4-year-old daughter was staying with her father, Bradley Jones, for the weekend. Saori took her 10-month-old son round to visit him. She was never heard from again. When she failed to turn up for an appointment with her caseworker 5 days later, staff at the refuge raised the alarm.
It was very unusual for her to miss any appointments, and it was very unusual for her daughter to have missed school, and we had contact from both to say that she hadn't turned up. And it was after that we started to try and contact her directly.
The refuge staff asked police to make a welfare check on Saori Jones, and 2 constables from Mirrabooka visited Bradley Jones's home. What they didn't establish was that Saori Jones was lying dead in his unit. The officers didn't go in. Instead, they accepted his story that she'd left her children with him and gone off with the best man from the wedding. To the staff at the refuge, Bradley Jones's story was simply absurd.
Her little boy was breastfeeding, and she just didn't like to be parted from the child. And to all of us at the refuge, it was like, well, that's not Saori. Saori wouldn't do that.
We told the police at the time that we didn't believe that this was the truth and we needed more action, and it took an awful lot of time to get that action.
The police at first wouldn't record Saori Jones as a missing person. When a further police visit to Bradley Jones was made, he fobbed them off again.
What happened with Saori was that there again was a failure on the police's behalf to actually take seriously the refuge workers' concerns.
Finally, after repeated requests from staff at the refuge, the police lodged a missing person report and went round to question Bradley Jones properly. It was 2 days before Christmas, 1 week after she'd been reported missing and 12 days after she'd disappeared. When confronted, Bradley Jones confessed that in a drunken rage he'd king-hit his wife and left her to die. The police found Saori's body decomposing in a bedroom.
The caseworker and myself, we were making Christmas parcels for the women. So it was pretty horrific. The 4-year-old, she was the one that was telling Daddy to stop. I mean, she's having counselling, she's had counselling. I mean, the thing that is so very, very sad is that she can't remember anything nice about her mother. What do you say to that?
Bradley Jones recounted how, after he had king-hit his wife and she was lying on the floor unconscious, he put their baby son to her breast.
The children had been left there for so many days, being looked after by this man who had killed their mother. How do you make sense of that? It's just outrageous.
But amazingly, his decision to try to hide his crime worked in his favour. Because of severe decomposition, the cause of death could not be conclusively established. And instead of being charged with Saori's murder or manslaughter, Bradley Jones pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of assault resulting in death. He told the judge,
"This has been a very big wake-up call for me. I just want to get back to my life and show everyone the real man I know I am, to give my kids the future I know they deserve."
In September last year, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
I wrote to the Attorney General asking, is there any way, could the state appeal this? And they chose not to do anything. They just accepted the verdict. And I think that the DPP, I'm not a lawyer, but, you know, I think the DPP rolled over. They should have pushed for a higher charge. They should have given a lot more effort into this case.
By Christmas time next year, just 3 years after killing his wife, Bradley Jones will be eligible for parole. Four Corners understands that under Western Australia's criminal code, Bradley Jones could have faced the more serious charge of omitting to act or doing an act and endangering life as a result. That charge carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. Western Australia's Director of Public Prosecutions denies that the charge could have been successfully prosecuted or that it would have resulted in a higher sentence.
Why wasn't he prosecuted with a more serious charge?
Because the advice of the solicitors at the time was that that was the appropriate charge. Now, you and I may not agree with that, but that is the legal advice at the time.
In jail, Bradley Jones has been taking parenting classes in the hope that when he's released, he will be allowed to take custody of the children whose mother he killed.
What's your reaction to that?
I think if he wanted to take care of his children, he shouldn't have left them in the house with his wife when she was dead.
The paramount objective here is the safety of those children. At this particular point in time, I must say that I'm not comfortable with the notion that someone like that, who's committed such an offence into the circumstances that he did, would ever have the capacity to get anywhere near those children. That is my personal position.
Coroner Alistair Hope, in his findings last month into Andrea Pickett's death, said the assessment that Kenneth Pickett posed a low risk of harming his wife was outrageously inadequate and inaccurate. No plan was ever put in place to prevent him carrying out his threats, and it should have been.
Was enough to protect Andrea.
Could her death have been prevented?
It was predictable and it was preventable. It was predicted by the Chief Judge. It wasn't prevented by the services that were there to try and assist Andrea. It wasn't prevented by the police. It wasn't prevented by the Department of Community Services. It wasn't prevented by the crisis care officers.
Strong recommendation towards there was.
We have to be guided by women who are telling their stories. If we're not listening to them, then our actions are going to be meaningless.
What I can guarantee you is that if a person out there watching this program feels threatened in a domestic situation and they pick up a telephone and ring their local police, that there will be an appropriate response. There'll be a proper investigation and they will be protected.
Through her family and the inquest, Andrea has now told her story. The question remains what her legacy will be.
How would you like Andrea to be remembered?
As a happy-go-lucky kid. One that loved her kids.
I would like to see her legacy be the beginning of a system that's actually effective in protecting women throughout Australia, and not just Aboriginal women, all women, because it's a serious issue. It's a national issue, and if it's not taken seriously, then we're constantly going to be doing these stories about families who have been destroyed, children who have been destroyed because women get murdered. That's what happens in these situations.
The deaths of Andrea Pickett and Saori Jones don't just reflect on one state, they're part of an ongoing national tragedy and a nation's shame, one we all have to share. Police around Australia are routinely called to well over 200,000 incidents of domestic violence each year. They're just the ones that are reported. We would have liked to talk to the Western Australian Police Commissioner about all these issues, but he declined. Instead, he sent a statement which is on our website. That's the program for this week. Until next week, good night.